So, for those of you who may not know who I am, I'm Joanne Richards, and I'm president of Common Ground for Texans. And as many of you know, we meet once a month, usually the first Saturday of the month, but it depends on certain availability of the library. And this particular week is an election day. So the library is being used for the election. And it's a local election. And Austin doesn't have any local elections. So, but other cities in Travis County do. So the library is available for voting today. So we have a program today on criminal justice reform that we can agree on. And we unfortunately had two people who had to cancel. Haley Hollick, who is with Texas Public Policy Foundation, had a family event that got moved. And so it got moved today, and she would need to attend. And the other was Lindsay Leonard, who had a migraine this morning. So we're down to two lovely people who will be talking about the question of, and I guess I should also say that one of the reasons that I wanted TPPF to be here is we usually think, or many people in our audience think of TPPF as being as far right as you could possibly go politically. But there are areas where we find common ground, and we do find common ground. We ought to be speaking to each other, and then that will bring common ground on other issues as well, as we explore things that are at least have some commonality. And criminal justice reform turns out to be one of them. So they apologize for not having to be here, but Lauren is with Texas ACLU, right? And the Texas Civil Rights Project is being represented by Meghan, both of whom have worked with Mark Levin for quite some time, and it was with TPPF. And so they can talk a lot about the relationship that they have all established on criminal justice reform. And as usual, we've asked Mike Nitkowski if he would moderate our conversation. I'm sure we will have lots of time to have question and answers as well. So I will pass it over to
Great. Thanks, Joanne. And thanks for actually putting together a very mixed panel originally across the political spectrum. She did a wonderful job of arranging that, and unfortunately two of our members had to cancel at the last minute. But we'll carry on and talk about a wide variety of topics here. Austin's a very busy place. Every Saturday there's something going on. Today's both an election day and Cinco de Mayo, so I appreciate those of you who are willing to journey south of the river to attend here. This is the community room for Wildflower Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm actually a member here. The minister here, Reverend Brian Ferguson, was on our panel a few months ago about the separation of church and state. He's joining us here as an audience member. We share this campus with Faith Presbyterian Church, and between the two of us, I think we're probably the two most progressive churches in South Austin.
Maybe Austin.
Maybe Austin. A long shot here. So we're kind of proud of that. We're more than happy to have this facility used as kind of a meeting room for all sorts of nonprofit, civic-minded organizations. So I want to welcome everyone here. The topic for today was finding common ground for criminal justice reform. And there are clearly some parts of this that are immersed in the culture wars, where it's going to be difficult to find common ground. But there's other parts of it where there is good opportunity to find common ground across the political spectrum. And Joanne put out a couple sample questions and topics where we may want to discuss this. And let me just go through those briefly. Last year, there was House Bill 122 that dealt with what is the age definition of when a child becomes an adult for the criminal justice system. And they tried to move from a 17th birthday to the 18th birthday. It passed the House, it did not pass the Senate though, so we're still at a 17th birthday of defining when someone becomes an adult in the criminal justice system. But there may be common ground in redefining when a child becomes an adult there. Common ground on bail reform. Some say we're creating a debtor's jail with the way bail is set up now. A lot of people just can't afford it. There may be common ground we can look at there. And then Joanne also suggested that looking at ways to reduce or eliminate the school to prison pipeline may also be something worth having some common ground discussions on. So we'll throw those out as questions for the audience and the panel to address as we go along. But our panel members are free to bring up any topic, a subject that they feel relates to what we're going to be talking about today. So we will do our usual process here. We'll go through each of the panel members. I'll give a little bit more introduction to them. They have 10, 15, 20 minutes if they want now to talk. I may ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up for the audience for questions. Today we'll probably have a chance to get around to every question from the audience, unlike we do in the past where we have a bigger crowd. But this is the select group who made it here today. So without further ado, let's start with Lauren Johnson. Lauren works for criminal justice reform policies at the local and state level that led to the first fair chance hiring ordinance in southern United States, removing the lifetime ban placed on people with felony drug convictions who would otherwise qualify for food assistance, and codifying a law to prevent video from being the primary visitation available in county jails across the state. Lauren was recognized for her work by Grassroots Leadership and the Texas Observer, and last year she joined the ACLU of Texas. Lauren.
Was I supposed to start talking
Yes,
now?
you
I thought you were going
were.
to run down the thing. Yeah, so I work for the ACLU of Texas under the auspices of the Campaign for Smart Justice.
And right now you're competing with air conditioning.
And our goal is to reduce prison population in half and reduce racial disparities as a co-equal goal, because if we do not set out with that intention in the beginning, we will just be dealing with more of what we've seen historically. And so, yeah, I mean, on the subject of the common ground, the ACLU of Texas is part of the Smart on Crime Coalition, and we just recently did a press conference earlier this week where, yes, we did a press conference earlier this week releasing the results of a poll where we commissioned this polling of primary Republican voters, asking a series of questions of where people fell on criminal justice reform, and the answers were overwhelmingly in favor of rehabilitation over incarceration, of job training, of treatment, and reducing prison sentences. And so I think that's, when you hear that from the voters, I think that indicates that we are in a place of common ground for criminal justice reform. So I'm very hopeful about what we can do with that in the upcoming session. We've got a short list of priorities that we'd like to work on. I recently was watching Massachusetts just passed a bill that I find very intriguing. It's called a primary caretaker bill. And what it does is creates a policy that says defendants who are the primary caretakers of underage children can file a motion asking the judge to take into consideration that they are a primary caretaker for these children prior to sentencing. And the judge has to make a written finding as to whether or not they're going to take that into consideration and use community alternatives to incarceration over incarceration. So either way, it creates kind of a pause button where we say, okay, not only am I sentencing this person, but I am effectively sentencing their family. And what we know is that children with an incarcerated parent are very much more likely to wind up incarcerated with behavioral health issues. These are the children that have high scores on the ACEs, which is adverse childhood events. Those kids wind up having more health problems. There's just a slew of things that happen when a parent is incarcerated. And so I think that that's just a small step that we could take that would create an opportunity for us to really think about the consequences of our punitive measures. I say that as a woman who had her first child while I was incarcerated. So, anything when I had just found out I was pregnant and I got arrested, I remember sitting in the jail and trying in my way to do research about what options existed for me. Could I possibly go somewhere and keep my baby with me? No, at the time that was not an option for me. Could I talk to court into giving me probation? I went to my attorney and I said, I'm pregnant, I'm having a baby. And at this point it had just really dawned on me, and I had just started wrapping my head around this idea that I'm going to be a mom, and what kind of mom do I want to be? What do I want to raise my child to be? And just really, and I suspect that most pregnant women do this, but I just really started wrapping my mind around this vision of the future, and told my attorney, I'm like, look, I'm having a baby. This changes everything. And my attorney looked at me and said, the state of Texas doesn't care if you're pregnant if you're committing a crime. And so I think the state of Texas should care. And yeah, so I feel like I've been talking too long. So
No, you haven't. I just want to say, none of this is on your resume for some reason. It's a great story, though.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay.
Are we going to have questions after?
We're going to have questions after, but as moderator, I get to ask one question now. So, I'm fascinated with your poll results. We often think of Republican candidates, especially during the primary season, of trying to outdo each other on how tough they are in crime, which seems very much out of step with the poll results. How do we get beyond that in a state legislature?
I think what you'll start to see is that the grassroots moves up, right? And so with a community understanding at the primary voter level of the need for criminal justice reform, I think we'll start to see legislators rise to that occasion. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think that if that's what the voters want, then it only makes sense to fall in line and to make smart decisions as far as criminal justice reform goes.
Okay, so hold your questions. We'll now go to Meghan Harding. She's an attorney and justice advocate. She currently works as a senior attorney for the Civil Rights Project, where she focuses on criminal justice reform. Previously, she was a prosecutor in Travis County and served as a staff member for the state representative Ruth Jones Clendon. Meghan is active in the Austin community as she serves as the director of the Austin region for the Texas Young Lawyers Association, as a board member for Austin Young Lawyers Association. She has previously served on the board as a board member for the Austin Black Lawyers Association, and she's still active in that organization. Last year, she was appointed to the Criminal and Civil Justice Working Group for the Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism. Meghan.
So I'm Meghan Harding, and I've actually been with Texas Civil Rights Project since February of this year. We have 3 sections, and I am in the criminal justice reform section. And what we do as an organization is impact litigation. So we bring lawsuits and try to effectuate change in the state through litigation, as well as try to protect people's constitutional rights. That's really what it's about. To that end, we examine systems. Mine are the criminal justice system and how it's working or not working, and in what ways people's constitutional rights might be being violated without their knowledge. So there are a number of unconstitutional laws that are passed, I believe knowingly, but no one challenges them, and so they get to sit on the books. And so we are just ever vigilant. We have a number of investigations going at any given time, and those investigations can span the time of some years, and sometimes they're really short. It just depends. We also have cases where people call in. A lot of times the call-ins are around cases of brutality, law enforcement brutality, and then cases surrounding suicides in jails. We've seen a lot of those. Or you might have some issues while in custody. People will call or write in about. We usually review those cases and make a determination on whether or not it's something that we can accept. We are a very small organization. We do not have a lot of resources, as we are a nonpartisan nonprofit. Nonpartisan nonprofit. Sorry, I forget. My voice is kind of heavy. So because of that, we have to be, unfortunately, we can't take every case, and so we have to be selective. As it pertains to my work, I am currently, there's a number of things that we have going that are public. There's a number of things we have going that are not. But the public things, there's, you'll see there was an article published by my director, so the director of the Criminal Justice Reform section for TCRP, pertaining to really the larger issue is how do we allow people to re-enter society, and what barriers do we put up when they leave prison to them being able to successfully re-enter. One of the things that we're looking at is an ordinance that was passed in Houston that essentially changes the distance in which people can live as it relates to parks, schools, daycare centers, and other essentially halfway houses, but they have named them alternate housing facilities. And the definition of an alternate housing facility is based on 3 or more parolees, irrespective of the crime that they were in prison for. Me and Lauren were talking about kind of those kinds of laws before we started today. So that's one of the things. And you can think that if you are part of the most vulnerable population, you're leaving prison with a sack of whatever you went in with and maybe $50 to $100, and you're released back into the Harris County area or whatever area you're released into, you're gonna have a hard time navigating with just that $50, that sack of things, and in a bus pass, which they take you in and kind of just drop you off at the bus station. And so I believe that we should be making it easier for people to re-enter and setting them up for success if that's really our goal. If our goal is to really reduce crime as well as reduce recidivism, then we should be giving people the tools that they need to succeed. Also, something that kind of gets lost a lot in the conversation about criminal justice reform is just prisons themselves. You hear a lot kind of on the front end of things, interactions with law enforcement, which we're certainly interested in as well, but we also really look at prisons and how they're run and what policies they have in place, and are they following those policies or are they not following those policies. And we produced a report in conjunction with the University of Texas School of Law, one of the clinics there, on the use of solitary confinement in Texas and what that does for a person's mental health, and then how that impacts their ability to re-enter society and be successful, or re-enter general population in prison and be successful. And so we are also looking at a number of issues that intersect with mental health, whether that be how law enforcement interacts with people with mental illness, all the way to how prisons treat people with mental illness.
So Lauren is involved with ACLU. I think most of the people are familiar with ACLU, but a lot of people are not that familiar with the Texas Civil Rights Project, where you were You listed a whole bunch of things that you and they are involved in. Can you give us like a 20-second advertisement?
I can try.
The Civil Rights,
So the Texas Civil Rights Project has been around for a really long time. We were started by Jim Harrington in 1990. And we essentially look at systems in Texas and use lawsuits and litigation to try to improve those systems. So we have, all right, we have criminal justice reform, we have voting rights, and we also have social and economic justice. We have offices in Austin, Dallas, Houston, South Texas.
You want to talk about election protection?
We're doing them, and that's kind of, Joanne, I actually met Joanne we had a big conference. It was the first one that brought together a lot of voting protection advocates. And so we do a lot of election protection work under our voting rights program. Under criminal justice reform, one of the big ones that Lauren is reminding me of that we just had is Texas. There was a Texas prison, and really this is an issue overall, but where people were dying because of the heat. It would get so hot in the summers in that prison. And so we were able to be successful in that lawsuit and reach a settlement where TDCJ is going to put air conditioning in that prison. And we had a co-counsel on that one.
Can I ask one other question? That is something that Common Ground is going to be doing in September that has to do with Census 2020 and potential for an undercount, and therefore the effects of that undercount in the state of Texas. And one of the things that comes up, and since we're talking about prisons and prisoners, are either of you, your two organizations, looking at how the prison population will be counted in terms of where they are residing now or where they come from before they were incarcerated?
We have not currently looked at that, but this is a lot of how we determine investigations or get investigations, things like that. Someone mentioning it, and we say, maybe we should look at that. And then we go forth and do so. So that, I think, is a really good point and something that could be good to look at. Are y'all looking at?
I mean, I don't know I feel like it's a thing that everybody knows about, and maybe I'm wrong about that. But so, is anybody here familiar with how it currently operates? So when they do the census, the people that are inside of the prison are counted for that district. They don't count for the counties and cities that they came from. And so it is the purest form of gerrymandering that you can come across. And it's highly problematic. And I think, there are two solutions, right? We could count people, there's probably more, but these are the two I'm sticking with. We could count people from the city, county that they come from, right? Or we could just give people in prison the right to vote,
right, because
they are still citizens. And I just imagine I spent so much time of my life being stigmatized and ashamed of the things that I had done, and just wanting a way to prove myself. Well, just let me do this thing to prove that I'm different now. And getting to hear Michelle Alexander talk when she came to Austin for her book tour, and she was talking about, there are 2 states in the U.S. that do allow their prisoners to vote. They're very homogenic. Did I say that word right? I feel like I'm talking about milk right now. So it's I think Connecticut and Maine. No, either way, Vermont. Yeah, either way. But there are other countries that allow all of their citizens to vote, and I get very curious when at every turn we want to restrict people's right to vote, because if we're a citizen, that feels to me like an unalienable right. And so I feel like we could create that. We need, if people inside of prison still had a vote and a voice as far as civic duty goes, how much different would our criminal justice policies look?
What was the book she was?
The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Era of Color Blindness.
Okay, let's open it up to audience questions.
Okay, I got questions for both of you, but I'll start with Megan first. I did volunteer work for the project for a while before you came, but the thing that struck me is all the work that they do, and they do win case after case after case, but the legislature never changes. And that seems to be, where we need to concentrate on, getting the changes. Because we got laws out there that are ludicrous.
Yeah.
And you get somebody arrested, and if there is a definite prejudice on whether they walk away or go to jail, and then, you get there and you can't vote. Maybe you got arrested for something that's so totally stupid, you should be able to vote. On the other hand, when you've got a real criminal, part of their punishment for their crime is losing that exceptionally prized, ability to vote. So, I understand that side of it. But like you said, there's a lot of people, probably 3/4 of them, that shouldn't be there. Just because we got stupid laws and stupid things that happen. So I would, think, we got to work.
I think I understood what you
said. How do we do this? How do we make a change?
Yeah, you're asking whether or not we attack it from policy in the legislature, whether or not we attack it through litigation, and I think we do both. So because we are a nonpartisan nonprofit and we're a 501c3, we don't lobby. So we don't do, we certainly are able to go and talk about, the legal aspects of something. Like, for instance, we went and testified at the city of Houston against this ordinance from the perspective of we think it's illegal and it has some constitutional issues. But outside of that, like the actual lobbying of going, door to door and kind of trying to get the legislators to do a certain thing, we don't do. But I think that as those laws pass and we are able to look at them and determine whether or not there are constitutional defects, then you do need an organization like ours who can go in and litigate those things and perhaps get them struck down. And the problem is what they do is come back and pass a bad law that's just constitutional now. So we do need to attack it from both sides, but that's why you have coalitions. That's why you have people in different facets of the system and doing different types of work so that we can try to effectuate the change and protect people's rights on both ends. In the state of Texas, just because of the makeup, it can be really hard from a policy perspective, which I've done that work too, to sometimes get things through. But I did find when I worked at the legislature, though, is our bills in particular, mostly our criminal justice bills had bipartisan support. So we had people that were very far right, some might even classify them as Tea Partiers, sign on as sponsors of our criminal justice reform bills.
Can you give any examples of those?
So one of the ones that I worked on was a commission that eventually passed, but it was a commission to study why Texas had so many wrongful convictions, because at the time I believe we were leading the country, and Representative McClendon, who's since passed away, had been working on it for years, and at that point we were able to get bipartisan support. And one of the things that they said is that they believed in protecting innocent life, and if someone was innocent, then they thought that they should protect that life, and that life should not have to enter the criminal justice system. So we were able in that session to get it all the way out of the House with overwhelming support, like almost unanimous support out of the House, and it died in the Senate committee. But the next year, she was able to pass it.
Lauren, does ACLU do any lobbying in Texas?
That's a great, so yes, so there's kind of two components to the ACLU. We are both a nonprofit 501c3 nonpartisan organization, and we have a C4 status as well that allows us to work on policy and do a small amount of lobbying.
Did you want to say anything else about the original question?
Oh,
Legislature versus courts.
Oh, I agree with what Megan said. When I go speak at colleges and things like that, I often start out with all the easy stuff has been done already. All that's left is the hard stuff. So not to deter you, but just understand what you're walking into is that this is the hard stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not going to happen just by a little bit of organizing or a little bit of policy work or some impact litigation. It's going to take all of the strategies that we can amass to undo the harm and to tackle the issues that stand before us. So, I mean, yeah.
One quick question for you. Well, you mentioned earlier about the somebody who gets incarcerated and may have small children. You use the term caregiver. Now, my question is, would that also include someone who's taking care of the elderly as well?
That's a great question. I think it should, but I don't know if our legislators would agree. I think a good case could be made for that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember my last incarceration, so there was more than one, to be sure, but my last incarceration, I had been clean and sober for 5 years. By the way, today is my 8-year anniversary. So I had been clean for 5 years and had relapsed. And I remember that time talking to my attorney and saying, look, I have 3 young children. I have a grandmother who depends on me. She lived out in the middle of Georgetown, not in the city, not near people, nothing. And that is where she wanted to be. She didn't want to be in a nursing home or in a place. This was her home. She wanted to stay there until she was gone. And so I was making that possible by going out there a few times a week, getting her groceries, cleaning her home. And so she was depending on me that same way. So I had 4 human beings that were very dependent on me at that time, and I was trying to talk to that attorney and say, is there some alternative? Isn't there a way for me to do probation? Because if ever I had been a candidate for probation, that was the time. But because I had already amassed a criminal history, they weren't willing to give me that chance. So I think, yes, I think that should be a consideration. I think we need to take into account that we are not just incarcerating one person. We are creating all of these other ripple effects into our communities that one way or another is coming back, whether it's paying for the incarceration and then all of the collateral consequences of that, and then all the collateral consequences for the family as well.
I take it you were arrested for drinking? Is that
Drugs.
drugs?
We had another question in the back. And you have to speak up because you're competing with the air.
Talking about lobbying, I was just wondering about the private prison system and what it would take to overcome that lobbying.
And is there any hope for bipartisan work on that?
I think it would take a new administration at the federal level, number one. And so what we saw was during the previous administration, under Obama, they had ended contracts with private prisons. And then when the next president took office, they renewed those contracts, and any of the ones that have closed down under a private prison facade or name or facility, that's the word I'm looking for, were reopened as immigration detention centers.
Yeah.
And so, it's kind of like whack-a-mole with the private prison industry, and then what we know is that they are already planning their expansion and have already begun their expansion into reentry services. So now these are the people that we're going to count on for rehabilitation and electronic supervision and treatment, and so they're already expanding. They see the future of criminal justice reform, and they're not going to be put out of business easily. So it's going to take a lot.
Yeah, I concur. I don't have much to add to that. I think it's going to be hard. I think to the extent that we can try to be vigilant and also kind of ensure that the public knows that that their rights still need to be protected, regardless of where they are. To that extent, we can use litigation to try to force some oversight, but it is extremely difficult.
Well, I was just thinking of the amount of money that they have too, because even if there's this common ground, they still have a lot more money than the people on the other side. And I think that they can bend politicians to their will just by that, by virtue of that.
Yeah, I think on depending on what kind of stepping out of representing TCRP at this point and just Megan, but I think that depending on which side you're on, like it seems that to some degree, just because of the values of a certain side, the money aspect will always be something that we're fighting, just because the values are so different. And so that doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that it's impossible, but we fight differently, certainly, for sure.
So in terms of the kind of the other side of this issue, the entities maintaining the status quo, are there community groups like this of like people that are actually trying to maintain the status quo, and how often do y'all spend time going to them or trying to, I guess I'm just wondering what people are the groundswell that is maintaining the status quo, or is it just the high level money interests?
There you go.
I think it depends. So like there's just been some surprising things, right? So if you talk to people in their language, so for some people, criminal justice reform is costing tax dollars, and I just don't want to spend tax dollars on that, right? That's not necessarily a language that connects with me, but it connects with someone. It depends on the issue. So for instance, when Houston was getting ready to pass the ordinance that changed where people could live if they are parolees, there were a lot of community groups that felt affected by these homes being in their community. So you had neighborhood associations, you had community associations that you had businesses that felt very strongly about wanting the certain homes to move out. But they might not feel that same way on some other criminal justice reform issue. So I really think that it really comes down to what the issue is. As far as like the time that we spend actually talking to those people, because we litigate, I spend a lot of time thinking about what their arguments will be. And to some degree, we get in a room if we can. We've had that happen in another case that deals more with like a city and how they handle tickets and giving people alternatives and letting them know all their rights when they come in to handle their tickets. So we've been able to sit down with them, and we've been able to sit down. Sometimes when we send a demand letter, sometimes you sit down very quickly. So it just depends on the situation, but it's a little bit different for us because we're not necessarily just doing the advocacy work in the same way as, maybe ACLU is able to do.
Are there community groups organized and advocating for getting tough on crime and maintaining the status quo?
Only in the comments section.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, candidates talk about it too. I mean, they talk about it.
And it also depends on how it's framed. So if you think about some of the conversations that have come up around the MS-13 gangs, right? And so there's a certain framing that's there's a lens, there's a way that it's presented to us, right? And then there was a really great article on ProPublica a couple of weeks back about a young man named Henry. And Henry was 11 years old in El Salvador and lived in a very poor village community and, barely getting by. And the gang was like giving his family food and doing things. And when he was 11 years old, one of the gang leaders came and gave him a knife and told him that he was going to murder this man that was before him. And I've got an 11-year-old, and I try to imagine how would my child react to a scenario like this. And then the man then told him that if he didn't do it, that he would watch the man die, and then he would also die. And survival is a very strong instinct, right? And so then it talks about, how he kind of got pulled in at 11 there, but that wasn't the life that this young man wanted. And then he was able to come to America, was going to school, was working 2 jobs, was just starting to come out of his shell, and then the gang found him there. There was a part of the gang that was already there, and they saw that hey, I know you, and so they told on him, and then he gets in trouble with the gang, and they beat him up, and they bring him back in and make him start doing things. So then what happens? Then he can't take it anymore, and he writes a story out to his teacher telling her who he is, what happened to him, and then the FBI gets called in, and they tell this young man that if he will cooperate with the police, they can help you. They can get you into witness protection. And by golly, who hasn't seen a story about witness protection where you're going to get, the new fresh start that you've always wanted? And so this young man cooperated with the FBI, and they used everything that he said to deport him back to a country that will murder him. And so I think about it depends on how it's presented to people, right? So if you just hear somebody up there telling you how MS-13 is this violent, terrible gang, and that may be to some degree true, and then we look at the layers beneath that and how does that happen, and what do we do with Henry's, somebody that's definitely guilty and not necessarily as responsible as we're holding him to. I don't know. I think I just went on a tangent and I didn't really answer a question.
Just a quick follow-up on that note. I'm wondering how much resource and time you dedicate toward media and producing your own content to win the media narrative, because especially in this era, it's sad in a sense. If it's not online, it didn't happen, or so, and I think these type of stories, like the story you just told, if there's like a 1-minute piece about that, as much as you
Actually,
can
I think
condense
I
it.
got an email from ACLU about that very story.
And
Really?
the
Get that
largest,
email, I'm mad.
yeah,
I get a lot of emails from
yeah, the largest voting bloc that doesn't vote, millennials, they don't open their emails.
Yeah.
So it's like, NOS Daily, like 1-minute
Yes,
videos, and so I guess I'm just wondering how much time and energy do you have a media team?
Yeah, we spend a lot. So we have a communications department that works really hard, and sometimes that's the strategy, because sometimes we can't litigate something. We look at it, we look at the laws, and we know that we can't litigate it, but we still think that we have a responsibility to the public for them to know about it. And so we do a number of things. Right now we have a podcast that is following it's in the Valley, and it's following the border wall and everything that's going on there with immigration. We also are very active on Twitter, which reaches millennials. We're very active on Facebook. And then we also publish, we publish blogs and op-eds. So we're always looking, for instance, when we started looking at the Houston ordinance and we started trying to make headway at council, and it was kind of apparent that we weren't going to be able to make that headway, then my director published an op-ed. So a comprehensive communication strategy is always kind of a part of what we do. We sit down with our communications team, talk about the issues, and develop it all the way out.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to his point about the communities or adversaries, and I'd like you to kind of talk about, there's a coalition called Smart on Crime, where these people can be both our soft supporters and our adversaries. For example, here in Austin, when we were working on fair chance hiring, Texas Public Policy Foundation was against it. But there are also proponents of criminal justice reform. So kind of talk about the nuance of that there are folks on the right with bipartisan support for some criminal justice reform while they're against others.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think that, and I don't know what the reason was for that, but I think that as you talk about, for instance, like a business association, that might be for some criminal justice reform because of tax dollars. That's usually what's going to speak to them. But something that they believe could affect their bottom line, they might not be for. We see that in like every single issue that we do. I think to the extent that we are able to find common ground and work together and get some changes, then we should go get those. But when they're divergent, then we're still in the position to just protect constitutional rights. That's what we do. So if they don't agree with it and we sit on this coalition, then we just know on this issue we're going opposite ways because we have to do what we believe is the right thing to do. But I do think it's a sensitive thing because you don't necessarily, I'm not sure it's effective to do it in a way that severs those ties completely. And certainly you can dialogue and you can try to bring them along and try to see if you can switch them over and get them to understand. And so, yeah, it's a delicate balance. But I don't know. I guess I'm saying, like, I don't think the fact that you sit in this coalition and you want something done on one thing together would stop us, at least, especially as litigators, from doing something that might be against them on something else just because that's what we do. I mean, we protect constitutional rights, period.
What she said. Well, and you know, Darwin was there fighting for that fair chance hiring ordinance as well. And I think that the thing that frustrated me around that is that, and it comes back to values and the things that you're fighting for. And so I think that in that instance, the free market and capitalism are very important values to a lot of Texans. And it was very frustrating to me, at least, because when I think of liberty, I think of individual liberty. When I think of, and when they're talking about liberty, they're talking about liberty for businesses and organizations and corporations. And I think that individual liberty should, to some degree, take a priority over that. But yes, so, and ultimately, it's not just people on the other side of the aisle from you that you have to find ways to work with. There are lots of people in power that until they've been replaced, we've got to find a way to work with the folks that are there. And so it's, just like what Meghan was saying, you find a way to agree on the things that you can agree on. And the Catholics with abortion, they're not having it, but they're really great on the death penalty stuff, right? And so, you've got to find your allies where they are and find a way to, it's one of the hardest things to practice sometimes, but for all of the advocacy that I do for people who are in prison and may have committed a heinous crime, I find it the hardest to humanize people that oppose my perspective, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the challenge, and that's where the opportunity lives, right? Is we've got to find a way to remember that the people that disagree with us are also our neighbors and our, and we've got to find a way to bridge that.
Did you have any follow-up comments or questions?
No, I asked a question that I knew the answer to. I wanted to help benefit the audience by asking.
Yeah. Okay. Has the ACLU had any success working with conservative groups on any issue?
I feel certain that we have, or we might not still be doing it, but I just joined them last year, and so while I know that the Smart on Crime Coalition has been happening for probably about 6 or 7, maybe 8 years now, I'm not in a wealth of knowledge around what those policies were.
Can someone give us a 30-second overview of what the Smart on Crime Coalition is?
The Austin Travis County Racial Roundtable. Lauren and I are members of that.
Can you speak up?
The Austin Travis County Racial Roundtable is a coalition of partners from TDCJ, adult probation, integral care, and Smart on Crime is also partnered with those on the right. One of the organizations here is Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is conservative leaning. And so where there are areas that we agree, then we support those criminal justice bills, just like Megan said, and where we differ, then we don't sign off on.
There has to be a unanimous agreement within the executive kind of organizations around what work will be done.
Front row here.
Yeah, Megan, you mentioned setting a commission was established to study why Texas had so many overturned convictions. I'd be interested in knowing what's the status of that commission, what did they find, and what are their policy recommendations?
Yeah, so I worked on it in 2013. Yes. So 2013, it passed in 2015, and I honestly am not exactly sure what all of the findings are. I know that the metrics that they wanted them to look at was from like start to finish. So did something happen in the way they gathered evidence? Did something happen in the way it was prosecuted? All the way through to witness statements, eyewitness accounts, things like that. But I don't want to speculate. I don't want to try to guess what their findings have been. I would think we're in 2018. So if a report is not out, I would think that they have one coming out. Because it takes time to gather all the information and study it and then compile it. So I'm not sure.
So you're saying it's still ongoing?
Yes, I do know it's in existence, yes.
I'd like to talk about mental health and the criminal justice system. So I know I read that the LA County Jail is the biggest supplier of mental health in the country. And what do you think, as far as legislation is concerned, what the rights do people in prison have and people in parole have to mental health? And how do you see that part of criminal justice reform around mental health? Because I've heard that up to like 50% of the prison population have mental health concerns.
I mean, the pieces of that I think about, so, yes, sorry, I'm trying to think of the timeline. So when we deinstitutionalized the state hospital systems and we stopped institutionalizing people for mental health issues, we really didn't have a backup plan. We didn't create community resources. We didn't do an adequate job of finding other ways to meet the needs that those hospitals, however horrendous or not they were somehow to some degree meeting. My fear, we do have, you hear it over and over again that county jails are the largest providers of mental health care. The problem is you're not providing a whole heck of a lot of mental health care there, and we're putting somebody in a system that is traumatizing, that reinforces a lot of the mental health issues that people have. So my personal perspective, I don't want to see that, right? I don't think we should be incarcerating people based on problems with mental health, and I want to be very cautious and aware that we can't just say, okay, well, we're just going to stop doing this. We've got to invest in the front end, is what I'm saying. Like, we have got to, just like education, just like, all of these issues are so intertwined. If we're expanding the money that we spend on education as rapidly as we spend it on criminalization, if we were to invest in healthcare, recently we had some subcommittee hearings at the Capitol on the opioid epidemic, which in Texas is not as, across Texas the rate has stayed pretty steady over the years. What we're seeing an increase in is meth use. And so they were talking with the Child Protective Services Division, and the conversation said something around 85% of the Child Protective Services cases are due to substance use. And when you're talking about areas that are in like Odessa and Amarillo and rural places that don't have access to treatment, very few of those families are getting their children back because the parents don't have a way to manage the problem. And then you take their children away on top of the problems they already had, and then what do we expect to have? We're not giving people solutions to their problems, we're just making it harder. I don't know if I just answered your question or if I went on another rant. Megan, take it away.
I think so there's certainly standards as it pertains to mental health care. So the courts have said that because, I'm trying to get it right, but because people are being imprisoned against their will, jails and prisons have an obligation to provide health care and a person's basic needs, and those needs can be interpreted in different ways. But they do have to provide mental health care. Now, how it's provided is a completely different thing, and the courts have not, they are reluctant, extremely reluctant in our area to find that prisons are not providing adequate care, health care, period, but that includes mental health care. And the standards are really, really strict as far as trying to prove that up. And then they give a great amount of deference to prison officials as experts to determine how things should be ran. But we have at least heard of mental health professionals being sent around to check in those exams. There's been varying reports about how those exams go. They certainly they should be providing medication. So someone who comes in and they are either diagnosed there or they have a demonstrable mental illness from their past diagnoses, they are to be providing medications as necessary. I think that one of the things that we would have to study and find out more information on is how it happens in different types of settings. So you have the state, TDCJ, but then you have local jails, or you have county jails. And how is it happening in those kind of localities where we know less about their standard operating procedures than we do TDCJ. TDCJ, you can pull their procedures off their website. But, what happens kind of in the local jails, and there's a rising consciousness, I think, in the state around jail suicides, because there's a lot of jail suicides that are happening kind of in the county realm, even pre-trial, so pre-conviction. And so certainly, I guess from our perspective, are people being properly trained? Is there proper oversight? Are people being properly monitored? What are they getting access to that they shouldn't have access to? Do you have jail staff and officials beyond the mental health care providers that come in, that they contract with, but that are actually on staff that are trained, like specially trained to interact with a population that might be suffering mental illness or be in an episode or anything like that?
And I think the police training in the front end is
Yes.
important. Mental health, you were talking about the front end. Well,
It would seem to me that this would be an extremely cost-effective way to address a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
But is there bipartisan support for improved mental health facilities?
Yeah, I think I think it depends on how you frame the argument. Like what Lauren said, I think that as you can speak in a certain language as it pertains to cost-saving measures, then yeah, I think there would be bipartisan support. Bipartisan support isn't as much a part of my world as a litigator. But thinking from a policy perspective, being back in the legislature and just like community advocacy that I do, then yeah, I think there would be bipartisan support on how we divert people, period, from jails and from prisons, in an effort, depending on who you're talking to, but cost-saving effort.
I also think that there's there's a difference between understanding that it's going to take some front-end investment. I think that that's something that most legislators would understand, is that, yes, we understand that there is a tremendous cost value on the back end. But, you know, not all of them are going to be there when that happens, right? And so right now, next session, we've got Hurricane Harvey taking over the entire legislature. We are going to be probably in a huge deficit as far as our budget goes. And so any bill that comes with a budget rider that says that it's going to cost more money, we've got a lot of perverse incentives in our systems, right? And so these folks could do it knowing, could pass a budget, could pass these policies knowing that, hey, sometimes you have to spend the money to save the money. But then it would be used against them in their next campaign because they're going to say, oh, well, they're not using their tax dollars well. So, I mean, we've got all of these different systems at play, right? And these people understanding the need to invest in the front end doesn't necessarily equate to them being willing to stick their neck out on the line and use up their political capital.
That's where education comes in, though. That's what we need to do.
Dan?
One reform idea that seemed to come to the surface in the months following Ferguson, when Eric Holder was still Attorney General, was that when there's a cop who's suspected of violating someone's rights, maybe we don't want the DA to be presiding over the grand jury and deciding what charges to bring against that police officer. And so the idea was to have an independent, I guess prosecutor would be the word. And it seemed like a real concrete step that could be taken that would improve protecting people's rights. So I was just wondering, what are the prospects of that? Is that feasible from a legal perspective, from a financial perspective? Is there bipartisan support for that kind of thing? Could that ever happen?
So you're asking if the state legislature would write into law a mandate that district attorneys across the state, I don't know the answer to that. But certainly, I mean, the DA's offices are able to bring in special prosecutors all the time to handle certain types of cases. And so whether or not there is a mechanism for it, they do that now to some degree.
Well, do you remember Holder talking about
Yes.
this idea? So
Yeah. And there's
he's talking
different,
about, I guess, on both the federal and state level.
right. And so so right now, I think whether or not that happens, I think is up to individual district attorneys. And so could there possibly, I think it would depend on what would the fiscal note be, and you know, if there's support for it across the board. And I'm not exactly sure. I know some of the arguments on the other side, but I'm not exactly sure if our legislature has an appetite to do something like that right now.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either, but I remember working for the last 2 sessions on creating an independent body of oversight for the prison system. Our current ombudsman setup is the ombudsman's office is actually part of TDCJ. And so, and from a prisoner perspective, I remember all of the grievance system felt like a joke. And then the ombudsman, when I think of an ombudsman, I think of a mediator. I think of somebody that's going to bridge the two sides and find a solution that is amicable for everybody. What the current ombudsman's office does is recites policy to you. So you say, oh, I had this problem with this institution, and they say, well, their policy is this. So it's not, there's no effort at finding a solution. There's no effort at mending the bridge. It's just a reinforcement of whatever TDCJ says. So, so we could either get rid of that agency and save that money, or we could build a separate entity that is not part of the same system to have investigative authority and authority to actually do something about complaints when they do happen. We ran into a wall time and time again with that. And part of it, a lot of it does have to do with the money, right? It's going to cost money for full-time employees and a new building and all of these things that they're talking about. So I think about that, and then I think about the Prosecutors Association, the Texas District and County Attorneys Association, and how involved in policy they are, and how they protest a lot of things that have to do with prosecutors. And I wonder if they would be in the way of that kind of policy change or not. And I don't know the answer to that.
I'd like to take a crack at it, because during that whole grand jury process, whether it's a special prosecutor or the acting district attorney, there is no counter narrative to what the DA wants to do. There is no adversarial process. The defense doesn't get to present their case at all against the police officer or the civil attorney for the victim's family. They don't get to present anything.
So I guess the premise is that there's sort of a conflict of interest between a DA who's kind of chummy with the cops. Is that true, that there is sort of a conflict of interest there? And
Yeah, I think it's premised on the fact that at least from an appearance standpoint, there is an appearance of impartiality or partiality, I guess. So, you know, whether or not that's true or not, I think depends on individual locations. And like specialized facts for where you are. I wouldn't paint that with a broad brush. But yeah, I think from the public's perspective, I think the public would feel a lot more confident if they felt like there was a person who was doing it from that did not have other interactions with these officers or not. But we've also seen in Travis County indictments come down with the DA in Travis County presenting it from an internal, like they don't have a special prosecutor they have a special unit, and that unit going to the grand jury and taking a stance. I think what you saw in Ferguson and what you saw in some of these other places is that the DA wouldn't take a stance. So when you go to grand jury as a prosecutor, you're going to grand jury to say indict this case. But what happened in Ferguson and what happened in a lot of these other national cases is they would go kind of present the evidence and be neutral. I don't know. They said they were neutral, but no one knows what happens in the grand jury room. It's completely confidential. But I think the feeling was that they went in and they were just neutral and they didn't present a side. So then, you know, you had time and time again grand juries, no bill in cases, which is when they don't indict. When you have a prosecutor that looks at the evidence thoroughly, interviews who they need to interview, does the investigation thoroughly, and then takes that case to a grand jury and presents the evidence as they normally, you know, would in any other case for indictment, then, which is, you know, what I believe has happened here, then you see some indictments come down. So, you know, whether or not we need to reform the entire grand jury system is a whole different conversation. But I do think that the argument coming out of Ferguson was that they needed a special prosecutor because that prosecutor wouldn't take a stance and wouldn't go in and just, you know, at least present a certain side. The prosecutors were continuing to remain.
Let's move on to other questions. Gentlemen.
Well, I was just going to briefly return to the mental health piece because I have some experience in that as a social worker at the state hospital, and something that will make you just completely hopeless about the whole thing. I think
Stop.
Well, I mean, but it's interesting to know about. There's a huge segment that is indigent, has mental illness, but I don't think a lot of people will know a lot of commitments at the state, and we're talking about the same money in some respects, right? It's kind of indiscriminate how some folks get funneled into the criminal justice and some wind up in the state hospital. But you'll see tons of people who really were committed because they're suicidal, and we set up a kind of system of coercive care that's really interesting. So people get committed, they're there long enough to get cleared and tell their 25-year-old social worker, that was me, the right things. So they get coercive care, they can be put on meds, and then they're discharged to a system where there isn't that same level of coercion. And it's a really kind of And there's no easy answer for that too, because you have a lot of folks who've been suicidal, and what do you do? But it's a system of kind of coercive care where the little bits of money we have for that treatment, a lot of it is dedicated to this kind of care amidst a lot of other populations too. So, and it's just one there's no good answer for, because who would want to say, well, we're not going to help folks who've had a suicidal attempt or are suicidal, but that's the reality of a lot of where our resources go to. Scraps out of scraps is what it amounts to. So.
I told you all that's left is the hard stuff.
Yeah.
Joanne.
So, do either of you feel comfortable talking about the legislation that passed the House on changing the age of a juvenile from 17 to 18? What that means? Because there was bipartisan support on the House side.
Yeah.
It died in the Senate.
Yeah,
they made it die in the Senate and not.
They've been trying to pass that for a really long time. Every session it comes back up. I think when you talk about brain development for adolescents, there's just like study after study after study that says that an adolescent brain is just not fully developed. Really, and I think in boys it's even later than 18. 25, right? Yeah. So I support raising the age, but I think that a lot of the opposition has been around the fiscal note that's attached to it, because you can just you throw any issue against the wall and the fiscal note is going to be an issue. So I think the fiscal note that is attached to it, because of how it would rework everything, so you're going to have people going from you have 17-year-olds right now that can go to a county system, or they might go to TDCJ. Now you're going to have more people going into presumably if we don't de-incarcerate. Now that's if we do these things and we de-incarcerate at the same time, I think our fiscal notes shrink a lot. So you'd have TJJD. You'd have district attorney's offices having more juvenile cases. So there's a reworking of the mechanisms in which we deal with juveniles when they get charges that is attached to that fiscal note. And I think that's where a lot of the opposition,
Well, it came close this time.
Yeah, it came really close.
So the other question, if I might, has to do with what I thought was a good solution to a bad problem, and that was life without parole instead of the death penalty. Until you realize that a 17-year-old can get life without parole, in which case you're giving them a death sentence in prison. And I'm not sure which is the better deal.
So the Supreme Court,
neither of them is good.
The Supreme Court just had a ruling that said you cannot sentence a juvenile to life without parole.
So let's take an 18-year-old.
Well, that's the thing. That's why you raise the age.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
but even so, it's.
But so on that same token, Texas hasn't done anything to fix that yet, right? And I think ultimately it is back to what Meghan was saying. It's not a philosophical debate. I think that most of the legislators would agree that we could raise the age and everybody could go home if it didn't cost all the money and require all of the reorganization. And I'd also like to, I keep hearing about the people that have to be kept away forever, and there's just a part of me that is not ready to buy that. And so we talk about life without parole as a good benefit to the death penalty, and you hear Anthony Graves talk, who was supposed to be executed, and he's talking about life without parole is a death sentence. It's still a death sentence. You're sentencing somebody to die inside of a prison. And I just know that every human that I've come into contact with has got the capacity to change. And in fact, usually they do. And so if we spent more time and invested more in helping people get there instead of just saying, oh, we can't help you, life without parole, death penalty. Man, wouldn't this be a great world to live in?
Yeah, I think as we, like, to that end, you know, I think when people say that, then they're automatically indicting our criminal justice system. They're automatically saying something in our criminal justice system does not rehabilitate. But for some reason, the public isn't making that connection. So if you say, we have to lock you up forever, you're never going to get better, then you're saying you have no interest in rehabilitating this person. But then you tell the public, the purpose, our main goal is rehabilitation. That's just not true. So, you know, it's interesting to hear that argument from people that's like, well, what are you saying about your criminal justice system? And I think that we have to look at the conditions in which people are living in prison. We have to amplify those conditions for the public to really understand. You know, if you take a person and you put them in solitary, although Texas calls it administrative segregation, because supposedly they don't have solitary anymore, but it functions as solitary. So when you put them in solitary confinement, and for years, and the psychological effects of that, you know, people get to the point where they're screaming, or they're starting fires in their cell, or they're flooding their cells, or they're spreading feces in their cell because they've deteriorated to a point, or that's what gets attention. That's what gets people to come and pay attention to whatever it is they need that they're not being given. And you live in that day in and day out for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And then at some point they give you a little bit of a step down and they put you back in gym pop, and then maybe you're going to be released. What have we done? We haven't rehabilitated them at all, and in a lot of ways, we have almost certainly made them worse. And then we re-release them in society and say, go forth and be successful, and then if they're not, then we demonize them and then give them more time than they had before when it's really no fault of their own. So we have to really reimagine prison and reimagine how we're doing things. And we have to amplify the rehabilitation is not necessarily what's going on inside of Texas prisons.
Can we learn anything, excuse me, can we learn anything from what other countries do in their prison systems?
Well, yes, we can learn. So we always can. That doesn't, I don't know. I feel like, I don't know. I guess my general feeling, again, this is Meghan, not TCRP. I think that America can just sometimes be really arrogant, and we have one of the largest prison populations of like the developed world, and we know that it's a problem, and we know that we're incarcerating people that should not be incarcerated for like addiction or mental health issues, but for whatever reason, a lot of times it all goes back to dollars. We don't want to change it. It's not that we don't have the information available. We certainly have the information available.
I have been working towards getting somebody to send me to Norway to go tour their prisons there. It hasn't come to fruition yet, but I'm still working on it. And so again, another homogenous society, number one, but you know, they're being held up in the media as an excellent model. They have very low rates of recidivism. They also have very low rates of incarceration.
Yes.
And so from TCJC, Doug Smith was talking to the warden from a prison either in Norway or Germany, and they were talking about the things that they did there. And so we're talking about a prison system that is designed to rehabilitate you. So it's designed to mimic the real world. These people have access to knives. They have keys to their doors. Their rooms are set up like a room, not like a prison cell. And they have classes and things to do to effectuate rehabilitation. And the warden was talking to him about their max facility. And what do you think of when you hear the word max when you're talking about a prison? Maximum security, right? And they're talking about maximum services, right? When we talk about max, what if we talked about max services? So these are the people that need the most help, and that's what we're going to give them. I also remember doing some research around the system that they've created there, and this wasn't something that happened overnight. This was something that took over 50 years to enact. They had a plan to start with. It was called the CROM, which I have intended to go read up on and create my own version of. I just haven't got there yet. Give me the summer.
If I can interject there, though, there's some states here in this country that do the very same thing. I mean, not all prisons are bad, not that they're necessarily good.
Tell me which
South
state.
Dakota.
Okay.
Yankton, South Dakota has a prison there where you are given opportunities to learn the trade. You're given opportunities to use the library. They have their own little room. You know, they don't have TV.
Well, we have that here in Texas too,
Yeah.
but I think
But it's not air conditioned.
No, it's not air conditioned. But the other thing that I would say that is, I think, a really big component to this, right? It's not just the facility and whether you have access to a knife or not. It's how the staff is interacting with you.
Well, and that's a very, very important thing. And it is, I mean, you just have to check it out to find out for yourself. But for one thing, it's not a private thing. It's a state prison. So, you know, the funding is different and the whole action is a little different. But Texas just has some pretty strange ways of handling things, in my opinion.
We always like to leave some time at the end so people come up and talk to the panel members individually. And I want to ask kind of a final question. Are you looking forward to anything particular this next legislative session in terms of a bipartisan effort on some topic?
I mean, you know, through the Smart on Crime Coalition, we've got a pretty solid list of policy changes that, you know, as a coalition, we are bipartisan, and so there is support. Now, whether that translates into a bill that makes it through the legislative session, and especially with Harvey issues coming up, that'll remain to be seen. But I have to believe it's possible, or I wouldn't keep trying. And so that's what I look forward to, is, you know, creating the change that needs to be made.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything, again, the legislature isn't a big part of what I do now, but I think that, you know, any bill as it pertains to juvenile justice, any bills as it pertains to reducing debtors' prisons and bail reform, especially as you talk about like just fine-only offenses and the impact of that. Anything to that nature, I mean, I think would be good. It'd be good to, you know, see some changes on that, and I think there seems to be bipartisan appetite for those things.
Any final comments? I'd say we had quite a few questions.
Okay.
I think I don't have final comments, just that I hope that if you were not aware of Texas Civil Rights Project, that you will look us up and become familiar with us and get to know what we do. And I hope that, you know, in the coming months and years, we are a resource for you. And even just for legal questions, just for, I don't necessarily have a lawsuit, I want to know, you know, about the law as it pertains to this area. Do y'all have some resources on that or whatever? We are located at Montopolis, essentially Montopolis and Riverside. We're 1405 Montopolis. And so also feel free to come over and just get to know us in the area. I do criminal justice reform, but we also have voting rights and racial and economic justice. A lot of that deals with immigration and things that are happening in the southern part of our state.
So we will meet in June, and we'll be back at, I want to say Yarborough Library, that's not right, Old Quarry Library. And we're waiting to find out when Yarborough Library may reopen, and when we know that, we may go back to that library. We'll just see. We will not have a meeting in July or August, but we'll be back in September with Dana DeBeauvoir talking about election security systems and what's in store for the state of Texas in the future. So if you are not on our mailing list and you would like to be on our mailing list, there is a sign-in sheet right there. We send maybe 2 or 3 messages a month. That's all. We will not inundate you with emails, but do help me thank our panelists today.
You can check our Facebook page. Don't forget to add